The landscape of Britain in the Middle Ages was very different from the Britain of today. In those days, the countryside was dotted with thousands of villages and hamlets, scattered, seemingly illogically, all over the land. Now, although a great many of these settlements have survived and exist today as our present villages and towns, it was discovered only comparatively recently that over 3,000 of these medieval villages had disappeared, had been abandoned and covered over by the turf of time. To the archaeologists, the search for and investigation of these lost villages are comparatively new areas of study. What were they like? What were the people who lived in them like? Perhaps most important, why did the villages disappear? Well, to throw some light on these questions, Mick Aston and I are going to visit several sites where a fair amount is known about what went on. But first, to talk about what a medieval village was like, and to give you some idea of how you could identify one yourself, Mick and I are standing in a bumpy field in the midst of a herd of cows, not far from the airfield at Yeovilton, South Somerset. There's a farm here now, and this place is called Nether Adber.
Well, we've come here principally because Somerset is not a county that was known for its lost villages. We will later on be looking at other counties where there are large numbers of them. Being eaten by a cow from behind. But Somerset was not known for large numbers of them. A few years ago there were some 17 or so that were fairly definite cases, and I didn't feel that this was anything like enough. There should be a lot more. And so we set about examining old maps, aerial photographs and so on to see how many we could come up with. And we now have about 150 to 200 in Somerset, of which Nether Adber, which we're standing in, is about the best example.
Are there more to be found, do you think?
I'm sure there are. We've looked at aerial photographs, we've walked across fields, we've looked for earthworks, these bumps and lumps that people will probably have seen in fields that they've walked over. And it's not difficult to go out and find more of them.
Now, you've talked about lumps and bumps, and indeed there are many lumps and bumps in this field, but actually I can't see anything.
Now, this is a misconception which I think we should point out to people, that in most villages that people are likely to come across, the actual building sites will be very obscure. It will be very difficult to see where actual farm buildings, barns and so on have stood. And the best they can hope for, really, is to recognise rectangular platforms, such as we have here, bounded by other banks and ditches into a roughly rectangular pattern. And these are the crofts, where the kitchen garden and the animal stalls and the farm buildings would have stood. But in this particular case, at Nether Adber, we're rather fortunate. If we come over this way, in fact...
To the cows again.
To where the cows are standing again. The cows, in fact, are standing on a medieval peasant house. And the evidence for this is perhaps very slight to the layman's eye, but again, it's a case of getting one's eye in. And if I sort of point out to you that there is in fact a rectangle here of a very low flattened bank, about 6 feet wide, going all the way around, so that it looks like
that's right,
a sort of semi-detached house that's collapsed and got grass over it.
And indeed there are gaps in the longer walls.
And there are gaps in the longer walls which almost certainly represent the opposing doorways which we get in the medieval sort of peasant houses and longhouses.
So they'd have had a door on each side?
A door on each side, and although this site hasn't been excavated, it's only been found for about 2 years, excavated examples have shown that the people lived in one end and the animals very often lived in the other end.
Yes.
We're talking about a building 30 to 35 feet long and perhaps about half that width.
Yes.
So
now, where would the garden or croft be?
Well, probably away, again, where the cows are, towards the modern hedge. Something in the region of what, perhaps about 30 or 40 yards each way. And on that would have stood the hayricks and perhaps a smaller barn, a flimsier barn, and the kitchen garden and cow stalls and so on. Quite a small area in relation to a farm that people think of today.
The emphasis being mainly on agriculture, you can probably say a little bit about the people who lived here.
Yes, very little in fact. We're certainly looking at a pattern of a group of small farmers living together in a little village. We know that their open fields, their strips were around. They were presumably growing grain, crops of one sort or the beans and so on. They would have had their cattle, their sheep, pigs and so on.
All for their own consumption?
Probably. It's probably a subsistence level here. From the number of buildings, there are about 12 crofts here. So if we think of perhaps 12 families with 5-6 people to a family, we're probably looking at a maximum of 60 people.
And this site is very small and manageable, and now that you've pointed out the little lumps and bumps and interpreted them for me, I can see quite clearly the pattern.
Yes, it does occupy quite a small area, and there must be a large number of sites of this sort of size to be found still all over the country.
Indeed, for the rest of the programme, we're going to visit several sites in Warwickshire, Wiltshire and Oxfordshire, where more is known about what went on. Now, Mick and I have come to Wormleighton in South Warwickshire, and we've just walked through the village.
Yes, a pleasant village with a church that goes back to at least Norman time, judging by the tower. A nice Tudor manor house in the middle.
Only part of it left.
Only a small part left, and quite a number of houses, probably about 150 to 200 people, and most of the houses being of 19th century date, very much like an estate village.
And the main occupation here, I suppose, would be farming, would it?
I should think so. Probably a certain amount of commuting now, because we're not far from Banbury or Warwick in each direction.
And now we'll go into a
large field with sheep.
hilly field. Yeah. Thanks very much. It's a cold and fresh autumn day today, a day for rubbing the hands together, I reckon. Now this field has a steep hill in it, and I'm just climbing up to the top of it. And turning round now, I'm looking west, having a commanding view over South Warwickshire, and at the same time, meeting James Bond.
Morning.
Morning, James. I can see there are a tremendous amount of lumps and bumps in this field, so there's obviously something going on here. What are we looking at?
Well, it's a very complicated set of earthworks in this field, covering something like, I suppose, about 45 acres in all, and we're looking at evidence of a number of different phases of occupation. The simplest earthworks to pick out are over on our right-hand side there, where we can see the ridge and furrow of the former open fields of Wormleighton.
We can see that quite clearly because some of the grass is parched and you can actually see the lines of it.
Yes, indeed, the drier grass standing up on the ridge tops.
And in fact we can see the sheep down in the hollows to get out of the wind.
Yes, that's a bit of authenticity, isn't it?
Then over to the left of that, a much more complicated set of earthworks, the most prominent of which are a set of fish ponds, a large rectangular pond and a run of 3 or 4 smaller fish ponds taking off from its northwestern corner.
Yeah, we should perhaps point out to people that these are dry at the moment and full of grass, and we know really from comparison with other sites that they are fish ponds.
Yes, the spring which formerly fed these ponds is still in existence, but it's been culverted now, and so the ponds are now dry.
They would have had quite high banks, wouldn't they?
Yes, I suppose the highest banks down there are all of 6 foot high in places, and the smaller run of ponds, even they are about 4 foot deep in places.
What kind of fish would they have had in there, do you think?
Pike, some carp is mentioned, bream, tench, the sort of normal coarse fish that fishermen go for today.
For food?
For food, yes. I suspect some of it was actually to feed the pike, because the pike was the luxury, and the others were just, you know, if you happen to get one.
One of the interesting things about this particular set of fish ponds is that it seems to be laid out right over on top of the site of the medieval village. When we go down to the lower part of the field, we'll see that the village street seems to disappear right under that lower run of fish ponds. And in fact, we've got no specific evidence for these fish ponds until an estate map of 1634. And it looks very much as if they're a feature of post-depopulation land use. They were laid out by the lord of the manor after the village had been depopulated, and this particular area was turned over to a small park.
So we've talked about the fields and we've talked about the fish ponds. Now, what are those lines, those channels, shall I call them, going right the way through the whole? There's a sort of network of them.
Yes, these seem to be leading off from the set of fish ponds, and they seem to represent part of a sort of irrigation system for the meadows. There's plenty of evidence from the 17th century onwards in some areas of quite elaborate water meadow systems being laid out, and this seems to be a primitive example. We don't know exactly what date it is, but it clearly post-dates most of the medieval earthworks in the field because it's cutting across them.
And can we see roads from up here?
Yes, we can see the line of the old road to Hodnell, another deserted village, leading off to the right through the ridge and furrow of the open fields there, showing up as a sort of hollow way or trench. The sequence of events is, of course, that the village was here first with its road, and after the village was depopulated, the fish ponds were laid out over it. Presumably the line of the village street was chosen because the clay would be closer to the surface there, which would, of course, hold water in the ponds. And indeed, if we follow on the line of the road up through the fish ponds, we come out at the little lane which you came down when you first came into this field.
Yes, and at the other end it's bounded now by this modern canal.
Yes, in fact it does go on beyond the canal on the far side there. Over on the left-hand side of the road, down at the bottom of the village in fact, we can see another quite prominent feature, which is the moated site of the medieval manor house. In fact it's a double moat, a moat with two islands, and the canal has rather conveniently used two sides of this moat for its own course.
I must admit, standing down here, I find it very difficult to put any sort of order on what I can see. How was it all set out?
Well, the line of the village street which we see before us is lined on either side by a series of house platforms, and the interesting thing about these is that they do seem to be quite carefully laid out. There's evidence of, I think, quite deliberate planning down here. The platforms themselves are not particularly prominent. There's no evidence of stone walling here. The buildings here in the medieval period were certainly timber right throughout. There's no phase of stone building at all.
Well, why is it empty now then, James? What happened here to clear all the villagers out?
Well, right through the medieval period we have evidence of a quite normal, fairly substantial medieval village here, with its basis on arable farming, with the ridge and furrow we can see round about us. The change begins to come in the later part of the 14th century, when there's evidence of an increasing turnover to pastoral farming. In the first instance, this seems to have been a case of voluntary abandonment of holdings, with peasants surrendering their open field strips and moving out of the village altogether, accumulation of holdings in the hands of some of the people who are surviving in the place. One just needs a few shepherds and herdsmen and so on, and the need for a large arable labour force has gone. But the particular aspect of Worm Leighton which is interesting comes in the early part of the 16th century, when we have clear documentary evidence for the final extinction of the village by the Lord of the Manor.
And in many of these places, and this is a good example, there was an incentive for the Lord of the Manor, in fact, to finally evict the remaining people and turn the whole place over to a ranch.
Yes, on this particular site we find that William Cope, who bought up the manor in 1498, the following year, in fact, destroyed 12 houses, 3 cottages, and converted 240 acres of arable land to enclosed pasture. And we're told that he drove 60 persons from the land. One of the smaller landowners, Sir Edward Raleigh, also destroyed 6 houses on this site. So we have just this specific documentation for the final destruction of the village, which was, however, already in a considerable decline before this point had been reached.
In modern terms, that sounds like a highly unsocial act.
Yes.
What would have happened to these people?
They're very difficult to trace, in fact, because the sort of activities of individual peasants are inevitably badly documented. One just gets a hint of where they were going. In Coventry, not too far away from here, there's a grocer's shop, if I recollect, with the name Worm Leighton over the door. And no doubt many of the people from places like this were making their way into the towns in the area and trying to seek a living there.
And perhaps some of them also became the wandering vagabonds and so on that we hear about so much in the 16th century, who caused so much trouble, robbing travellers and so on.
Well, now Mick and I have come to Wiltshire. We've come to Fifield Down, and we're going to meet up with Peter Fowler. I must say, Mick, it's rather satisfying meeting up with somebody on a map reference. Hello, Peter.
Hello. I'm glad my map reference worked out all right.
Yes, well met, I think.
Yes, well, I imagine this site looks very different to the one you've just seen, because as you can see straight away, it is very small. It consists merely of 2 small enclosures surrounded by a bank and ditch, and I suppose the whole lot doesn't cover more than about a third of an acre. It's about the size of a garden.
So it's one single farm or a couple of
Yes,
farms
this
rather
is
than
it.
a complete village?
It is a farm rather than a village, and so the earthworks look quite different. Now, when we first came here, you could, as at Worm Leighton, see the sites of what we thought were buildings. And one of the differences here was that because it's small, I think largely, we were able to excavate more or less the whole of the site. So we've been able to marry up the documents and the archaeology very nicely here.
Yes, it certainly seems much more manageable, and there's a great sweep of countryside across the other side. We're looking down now, towards the A4?
Yeah, towards the A4 and the Kennet Valley, and the position of this site is one of the keys to understanding why it is here in the first place and why it was abandoned.